continuing with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days. In our last session, we left off having just begun the chapter on Wednesday, July 31st, and that's where we resume today in this session. Haig and Bizart had discussed the problem before. The general had expressed grave doubt that it was his and Bizart's job to force a president to resign. He had even questioned the propriety of recommending resignation. That, too, would be a form of pressure. There were constitutional considerations as well as moral ones, and there were dangers. He and the lawyers had access to the president. They really had undue influence over him. They were only staff men, after all. Nobody had elected them. The president was elected by the people. Suppose an ex-president were to accuse his aides and their congressional allies of forcing him out of office. Were they brushing perilously close to coup d'etat? There was also the question of whether they could make such a recommendation effectively. The president was not even likely to listen. They would not intimidate the president by threatening to resign. They had promised him that long ago to assure him that he could trust them with the truth, that no matter how bad it was, they wouldn't run out on him. The president had not been truthful with them, of course, but Haig was certain that the president felt he had been honest. Richard Nixon was in touch only with his private reality, Haig was sure. To attempt to compete with his private view of reality was an impossibility. Haig now put forth the notion that Nixon must make the decision. It must be perceived that way by the president, by the country, by the historians. It has to be a willing act on his own part, Haig insisted. We can't force him. If asked their opinion, the president's advisors might, at the right psychological moment, be able to recommend resignation as an attractive choice, but never must they be on record as telling Nixon that he lacked other alternatives. It was admittedly a subtle distinction. Meanwhile, events had to be slowed somehow. Preparations had to be made. Others had to be brought into the picture, particularly Price and Buchanan. They would write whatever had to be written for the president, and there was no question that some important writing was going to be required eventually. Also, Price and Buchanan were excellent sounding boards. The president trusted them. Haig trusted them. And I'm going to stop here for just a moment to offer a personal observation. It's interesting that nowhere in all of this talk of resignation and impeachment, nowhere in this talk of bringing others into the picture and so forth, and what would be needed, what the president would need, what would be needed in the situation. Nowhere so far. We'll see how much further we get, but nowhere so far has the name Gerald Ford, Vice President of the United States, been mentioned. If there was going to be no hard recommendation that the president resign, there would still have to be some conditioning. Someone would have to get through to Nixon, help him see the realities, let him know just how bad the tape made things. Al, you shouldn't have to carry the burden alone, Bizart said. We'll carry the message. Haig agreed to take them to the president. They did, after all, have an obligation to let their client know just how untenable they thought his situation had become. But if it got down to a definite recommendation to resign, Haig warned he would not join them. Haig left the West Wing and walked over to the president's office in the EOB to tell him that Bizart and St. Clair wanted to see him. There's no need to talk to them, the president snapped. Haig said that they merely wanted to offer their assessment personally. Nixon was firm. He did not want to hear from them. He was well aware of their views. They wanted him to resign. They thought it was somehow all over. Haig crossed the street to carry the message back to St. Clair and Bizart. Once again, the president would not see his lawyers. Now what? Bizart and St. Clair realized that it was up to Haig. He would have to convince the president that his case was lost, that he would have to go, Bizart said. I'm not going to push him, Haig repeated. He has got to make these decisions himself. And right now, Haig said, the president was convinced that his lawyers were wrong. Should I listen to the tape? Haig asked. No, don't listen to any tapes, Bizart advised once again. But a transcript should be prepared immediately so that Haig could get a clearer idea of the breadth of the problem. And the lawyers could advise Haig better how to deal with the president if they had a transcript. Haig agreed. He went back across the street to ask permission to make a transcript. This time, his meeting with the president took longer than before. Nixon saw no need to make a transcript. Haig argued with him. It would be difficult to mount a rebuttal without a transcript, he said. Reluctantly, the president agreed. Haig returned with the okay. Now, who would transcribe the tape? Rose was definitely out. Who could be entrusted with the sensitive job? Finally, they settled on Patricia McKee, Haldeman's former secretary. She had the best ear for the voices. The lawyers returned to their offices. Haig remained in his office, pondering what to do next, puffing steadily on one cigarette after another. He got up and wandered over to Kissinger's White House office. He found Scowcroft there. Kissinger wasn't in. Scowcroft saw trouble on Haig's face. "What's going on?" he asked. Haig sat down. "You wouldn't believe my problems," he told Scowcroft. "The president refuses to see his lawyers. We have another problem, and in this climate we can't sustain it." Scowcroft didn't press. He suspected that the problem Haig referred to was on the tapes. He recalled a conversation he and Kissinger had had in the spring. There must be real dirt on the tapes, Kissinger had said to him, otherwise the president wouldn't be fighting so hard. Scowcroft had suggested that perhaps the president was fighting for the principle, to preserve the confidentiality of the office. It was true, Kissinger had replied, that the president cared about the office, but he would gladly sacrifice the principle to save Richard Nixon. He cares about the office, but he cares about Richard Nixon more. End quote. Now it appeared that Kissinger's suspicions about the tapes were well-founded. Haig got up to go search for Kissinger. He certainly didn't want to give Kissinger this news on the telephone. There was no way of knowing how many people would be listening. Haig located Kissinger a few minutes later, and in his oblique fashion sketched the latest developments. Their mutual distrust was apparent. Haig was almost as vague with Kissinger as he had been with Scowcroft. There was a bad tape, he said, not necessarily fatal, but some of the lawyers thought it was. There had been bad times before, he suggested, and the lawyers sometimes tended to panic. But the tape makes it clear that the president was involved in the Watergate cover-up. Kissinger was hardly startled, but he chose to play things cautiously with Haig. The secretary had certain interests to protect. Watergate was already battering his foreign policy. The prospect of a Senate trial, even a short one, summoned nightmarish visions. It had to be averted at almost any cost. The president would be incapacitated for months. Kissinger didn't share these thoughts with Haig. He wanted to have a position on both sides of the fence, to show that he recognized the gravity of the situation, but at the same time that he was not among those deserting the president. Kissinger didn't trust Haig with a frank assessment. Any remark he made might well be carried back to the president. Haig always looked out for himself. Haig trod with equal caution. He carefully advanced the view that the president must not be overthrown. It was the chief of staff's job and Kissinger's to keep the government going until there could be a calm resolution. Kissinger was thinking that everyone was going to have to summon extraordinary restraint. The situation was highly explosive. He and Haig might never be able to level with each other. Even so, they might be able to work together. Early that morning, Buchanan had received a phone call at home from Timmons. Haig had apparently kept his promise to take up option 2 with the old man. There was receptivity in the Oval Office, Timmons informed Buchanan. In spite of his personal opposition to the plan, and in a footnote, they explained the plan was also called the Frey Plan, F-R-E-Y, after Representative Lewis Frey, Jr., a Florida Republican who had unsuccessfully proposed it 5 months earlier to speed up the impeachment investigation. In spite of his personal opposition to the plan, Buchanan said he would float the idea to reporters. He was due soon at the Sperling Breakfast, a weekly journalistic ritual organized by Godfrey Sperling of the Christian Science Monitor. These on-the-record breakfasts allowed politicians to test the political waters with 10 to 20 reporters. That morning, Buchanan remarked to the newsmen that the White House was weighing a concession on the House vote and considering moving its case directly to the Senate. It was the first public acknowledgement by the administration that the president was going to be defeated in the House. Buchanan's news was on the wires by 10 a.m. On Capitol Hill, it was received with anger and disbelief, particularly by the president's supporters on the House Judiciary Committee. Wiggins was infuriated. "I don't care if Nixon called me and said that's what he wanted. I don't think it's right." By early afternoon, Buchanan was busy puncturing his own trial balloon. "The old man's people on the Hill are appalled," he reported back to Timmons. As the fallout worsened, Dean Birch got word from the president, "Kill the plan." The White House had not only miscalculated the mood in the House, but was also failing to pick up on what was happening in the Senate. Birch and Timmons had calculated an unshakable base of between 35 and 40 Nixon senators there. In his office that day, Senator William E. Brock III of Tennessee, regarded in the White House as a certain pro-Nixon vote, marveled to a reporter at the dream world the president and his men seemed lost in. There was only one way Richard Nixon could win in the Senate, Brock figured, and that was some new exonerating evidence. And after 15 months of watching the president's defense crumble under the weight of Nixon's own actions, he said, "There's no realistic way I can see to support acquittal, and that's the view of a lot of Republicans they're counting on. At least half the Republicans on this side are already gone. Nixon's maximum hardcore support in the Senate is 20 to 26 votes." End quote. He needed 34, and the talk in the cloakroom that day was of resignation. Many of the senators on whom the White House was banking wanted a quick end. "I don't think the president can avoid considering it when he finally sees the numbers in the Senate," Brock said. "But if he says, 'I want a trial,' God, he'll get it, and it will be a fair trial. There's no longer any hesitancy or fear. The House Judiciary hearings have seen to that. There's a growing feeling that a pro-conviction vote is good for the country and a safer vote." Brock doubted that a delegation from the Hill would march on the White House to urge resignation, however. He wouldn't listen anyhow. Everybody has tried at one time or another to help him, begged, pleaded, and he doesn't listen. The president has put too many people out on a limb too many times. The White House has used up all its goodwill and credibility. The same reporter encountered Barry Goldwater in the Capitol subway. Goldwater agreed with Brock's assessment. "There's no one individual who can stop this now. There's not even one group of people who can stop it. If the president wanted to listen, he would have listened already," Goldwater said. The Nixon presidency was finished. Two other influential Republican senators in the certain column, Robert Dole of Kansas and John G. Tower of Texas, were also moving toward convicting. Tower explained his reasons. "I suppose there is a certain amount of amorality that almost all politicians will tolerate, but there is also a threshold, and that is the president's problem. The senators feel very strongly about the historical magnitude of this thing, and very few will be willing to undercut their duty, especially for Richard Nixon." Dole, as Republican National Chairman, had been badly burned by his consistent defense of Nixon during the 1972 presidential campaign. His bitterness this day was apparent. Everything Nixon touches seems to turn to ashes, but now the trauma is gone. The argument that the country can't stand the strain is no longer a consideration. 58 to 60 votes are already pretty solid for conviction. Without new evidence, the rest would come easily, he said. Late that afternoon, Haig met in his office with the senior staff. Timmons, Birch, and Gergen had been urging him for days to lead some organized defense. "Everyone is talking about preparing carefully documented factual briefs rebutting the articles of impeachment, but no one is actually doing anything," Gergen said. Haig was finally ready to mobilize. There were about a dozen selected staff members present, speechwriters, lawyers, and congressional liaison men. They would construct a defense against each article of impeachment, first for the House floor, and then, it now appeared certain to them, for a Senate trial. Neither Haig nor Bizart mentioned the tape. The mobilization, said the general, would be supervised by himself, Ziegler, Buchanan, Price, Timmons, Bizart, St. Clair, Birch, and Charles Lichtenstein, Birch's deputy. They would provide the strategy, supplanting the old Birch strategy group. Juwan would sit in with his clipboard. Their decisions would be implemented by separate task forces for each impeachment article, with a lawyer and a speechwriter on each team. Clausen, whose zeal was limitless, summoned his task force immediately. He seemed invigorated by the prospect of battle. He reminded some in the room of a football coach exhorting his team after a disastrous first half. "Okay, you assholes," he seemed to be saying, "let's go out there and break some heads." Bizart had said virtually nothing during the meeting in Haig's office. He had little desire to get involved. He went home early and told his wife that the president would be out of office very soon. He might resign on Friday. St. Clair went to seek Leonard Garment's counsel. In emotional terms, he described the impasse at which he found himself. The tape, a client who first lied to his lawyers and then refused to see them, members of Congress who seemed to blame him rather than the president. What were the responsibilities of a lawyer in such a situation? He had made false and misleading statements to the Judiciary Committee and to the courts. Were there not higher obligations now than defending the client? Maybe he should resign. Garment sipped his coffee, listening quietly and reflecting on his own experience. The ordinary standards of lawyer-client relationship could not be reasonably applied to this case, he suggested finally. This case was too extraordinary, bound up with unprecedented responsibilities. Somehow the president's lawyer had simultaneously to serve the office, the man, and the national interest. St. Clair's resignation, especially now, would serve none of these, Garment said. This was a time of, quote, terminal responsibilities, a time for special care and empathy for the sake of the client and the institution. Everyone involved was now fanning the fading embers of survival, Garment observed. Each had to play out his own role. In the end, St. Clair would be respected for seeing it through, Garment assured him. It was especially important that the president's lawyer remain calm, that he be a stabilizing force. Otherwise, there would be chaos. The mood of the country, the Congress, the press was hostile, bitter. If the Constitution was to work, the presidency must not be destroyed in the process. St. Clair was steadied by the advice. It nourished his calmer instincts. Winding his way through the White House, studying documents and reading testimony, he had concluded that there was little about this case that was black and white. Many events which at first seemed the result of deliberate action by the president or his assistants were not in fact deliberate. Garment was right. Things could get out of hand. There might be a crisis. It was delicate. Of course, he would stay. It was nearly 6 o'clock when Haig finished briefing the president about his morning's conversation with Kissinger. The president left the EOB for the Oval Office, and Haig walked with him as far as the driveway, where the general was met by St. Clair's press aide, Larry Speaks, and a limousine. For months, Speaks had been urging Haig to meet with Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. It was Speaks's contention that Eastland, his old boss, was the key to handling a Senate trial successfully. In June 1973, when he accompanied the president to the dedication of a memorial to the late Senator Everett M. Dirksen in Illinois, Eastland had told Nixon, "I don't care if you're guilty or innocent, I'll vote for you." Speaks led Haig to the senator's office and introduced them. There were few formalities. They talked for about 35 minutes. Eastland agreed that the president's choices were grim. His chances for survival were not good. Haig had consulted with people whom he thought the president might ordinarily have turned to for advice. Kissinger, Eastland, the lawyers. None seemed resistant to the idea of resignation. Whatever was going to happen, he wanted the vice president to be kept abreast. All right, that's the first mention we've seen of Gerald Ford, I think, in part two, which began with, let's see. Part two began with Wednesday, July 24th, and 66 pages later, we're in into Wednesday, July 31st, into the evening of Wednesday, July 31st. So over a week has passed, 66 pages passed, and I believe this is the first mention we've seen of Gerald Ford. I could be wrong, but to my memory, in part two. All right, so whatever was going to happen, let me back up to the beginning of this paragraph. Haig had consulted with people whom he thought the president might ordinarily have turned to for advice. Kissinger, Eastland, the lawyers. None seemed resistant to the idea of resignation. Whatever was going to happen, he wanted the vice president to be kept abreast. The president had agreed that Ford should be briefed. Now, alone in his office at 7:30 p.m., Haig placed a call to Ford. The vice president had already left, however, and Haig spoke to Robert Hartman, Ford's chief of staff. Haig had a low opinion of Hartman, a former newspaperman whom he judged a heavy drinker and a leaker. Haig didn't want to give Hartman any impression, however remote, that he was calling about anything extraordinary. Such a message would be telegraphed to a good number of anti-Nixon reporters. The general asked matter-of-factly whether the vice president could see him for a few moments the next morning. Hartman entered the appointment on Ford's schedule. As Haig and Hartman spoke, Buchan and Whitehead were continuing their preparations for the transition from a Nixon to a Ford presidency. Both now were almost certain that they were planning for a reality. David Eisenhower thought that events were moving beyond the president's control. Twice that week, his father-in-law had said that he definitely wanted Julie and David to be at Camp David for the weekend. The unusual urgency of the request made David and Julie sure that something important was happening. That afternoon, David had lunch with Pat Buchanan, but Pat had said nothing concrete. On the contrary, Buchanan had taken a very tough line, arguing that the president should admit nothing in the House debate, that Nixon's supporters should portray him as a man besieged by the press and by partisan enemies, persecuted for the same sins that were countenanced under his predecessors. David had argued vigorously with Buchanan. In light of the judiciary vote, his only choice is to effectively plead nolo contendere, he said, and admit his mistakes. David believed deeply that Mr. Nixon was less in trouble for what he had done than for his repeated denials. The reality of the transcripts undercut too much, David said. He suggested that the president should admit his participation in the cover-up and acknowledge he was guilty of woeful misjudgment, but not of criminal conduct. Contrition, even at the 11th hour, would carry Mr. Nixon a lot further than contention, David believed. The discussion was resumed that evening as the Eisenhowers and the Buchanans dined at Father John McLaughlin's Watergate apartment. Buchanan, uncomfortably aware that the president's daughter was at the table, had little taste for the exercise. But David seemed hell-bent on raising the question, what does the evidence show, and answering it. He said it showed that the president had been involved in the cover-up. Julie, incensed, turned her anger on David. Undeterred, he argued that the basic reality of Mr. Nixon's abuses should be conceded in the House debate. His wife seethed through the rest of the evening. Richard Nixon, too, was gripped by anger that night. He had spent most of the day with Ziegler, once again the bearer of bad news. John Ehrlichman had been sentenced to 20 months to 5 years in prison for his role in the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, a shameful episode in the history of this country, the judge in that trial, Gerhard A. Cassell, had called it. Ziegler's talks with the lawyers that day had profoundly depressed him. The president's choices were narrowing. The tapes were obviously devastating. Haig seemed convinced that the lawyers were right, that the president would be forced to resign or face conviction in the Senate. But Nixon refused to see it that way, and this evening, alone with Ziegler in the Lincoln sitting room, he was in no mood to hear what his aide was telling him. Ziegler was in the role he most disliked, identifying bleak alternatives which the president refused to face, plowing new ground, isolating grim choices, pointing out unfortunate facts. The drastic options now before the president were not the work of his enemies, Ziegler said. This time it was the lawyers, Haig, maybe even himself, who could see no easy way out. The president's reaction was not unlike Julie's to David that night. To father and daughter, David and Ziegler seemed to be saying things that should not be uttered by those who believed in the president, things that were almost disloyal, words that seemed to abrogate the contract of faith which bound them all. Ziegler was exasperated. He only wanted the president to understand how dire things were, to recognize the hard choices fast closing in on him. But the president would not even accept the meaning of the words on the tapes and refused to believe that his lawyers were acting in his interest. Nixon rose and told Ziegler to get out. Ziegler was incredulous. Nixon was so angry, so consumed by rage, that Ziegler thought the president might never again speak to him. Out! And thus ends Wednesday, July 31st. And in the next session, we will resume with Thursday, August 1st, 1974, In the Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thank you for watching.